Great. So thank you so much for joining us for the 15th session of the WEPs Deep Dive series, Financing for Gender Equality. My name is Miwa Park, and I am WEPs Coordinator at Women's Empowerment Principles, WEPs Global Secretariat at UN Women. Today's session aims to explore some innovative approaches to financing gender equality with a focus on private sector engagement, topics like gender lens investing and sustainable finance. So throughout the month, the WEPs team have been sharing resources and tools related to this topic on our social media. So in case you're not following us on LinkedIn, you can simply scan this QR code on the screen to follow us on LinkedIn. So we have a very packed agenda today, and let me go over today's agenda. We'll first hear from some introductory remarks from Anna Feld. She's the head of the WEPs Global Secretariat here at UN Women. Then I'll introduce you to today's amazing speakers. Then they'll present, and we will head to Q&A session. So I'll continue with my logistical reminders. So we have a function, translation caption function available from Zoom. So you can see your translated speech in real time by clicking on captions function at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to write your questions to the panelists in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen throughout the webinar. And if you'd like to communicate with other participants, you can use the chat function as you're doing right now. Your questions will be answered during the Q&A session or throughout the chat anytime, throughout the webinar anytime. So please share those when you have those. Also, I wanted to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and later will be uploaded and shared on www.weps.org website to be shared with general public or those who couldn't make it today. Lastly, we will have a short evaluation survey that will pop up when you're leaving. So please take some time to answer it. We do take a look at the result to improve our future webinar series. So now to get us started, I would like to invite Anna to deliver her opening remarks. Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Miwa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on financing for gender equality. I'm truly delighted to see such strong interest from private sector leaders, financial institutions, development organizations, and many others working to make gender equality a reality. The diversity and scale of today's audience is a powerful reminder that gender equality is not a niche issue. It is essential to how we build inclusive, resilient, and future-ready companies and economies. At the same time, gender equality remains one of the most underfunded areas in global development. The 2030 agenda will simply not be achieved unless we significantly scale up financing in women's rights, leadership, and economic development across sectors, geographies, and value chains. The private sector is absolutely central to this agenda, not just as a source of capital, but as a driver of innovation, accountability, and systemic change. From how companies invest and procure to how they measure and impact and manage the risk. Every financial and operational decision has the potential to advance or hinder gender equality. We have ample evidence closing gender gaps in labor force participation, wages, access to finance, and leadership could add trillions of dollars to global GDP. Yet, only a small fraction of global development finance targets gender equality as a primary objective, and gender lens investing still represent a fraction of capital markets, and budgets to advance gender equality within companies also remain limited. That is why the discussion like today is so timely and so important. This disconnect between intention and investment is something we must address together. As we look ahead to the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development next week in Spain, the world has a unique opportunity to reset global financing frameworks and ensure that gender equality is a foundational pillar on how we mobilize and allocate resources. This upcoming conference must be a turning point where we move beyond commitment to meaningful accountability and impact for gender equality. At UN Women, we are working with partners across the ecosystem to help make this shift a reality through the WEPs, our work on gender-responsive procurement, engagement with ESG and finance communities. We are supporting companies, banks, investors, and others to embed gender equality into the core business models. We are also contributing to global processes by bringing women's voices to the table and by promoting tools, standards, and policies that enable inclusive finance at scale. In today's session, we'll hear from leaders who are tracking financing trends and helping reshape what financing for gender equality looks in practice. Whether you're here as a finance decision maker, a corporate sustainability leader, a gender equality advocate, or simply somebody who's curious about how money can move the needle, we hope that you will leave today with new ideas and energy to act. Let me close by emphasizing again that financing for gender equality is not a side issue. It's a core business, investment, and development strategy. When we shift capital to where it matters most, we create more equitable, resilient, and profitable outcomes for everyone. So thanks again, everyone, for being with us today. Back to you, Miwa.
Thank you so much, Anna. I like your statement that money moves the needle, and let's see how much we can move the needle. So with that said, I'll introduce you to today's speakers. We have three speakers joining us today. Jenny Hedman, she's a policy analyst at the OECD. She works at the Gender Equality and Development at OECD. She focuses on the implementation of DAC recommendation and guidance on gender equality for development partners, as well as on development finance for gender equality. She coordinates a DAC network on gender equality, which brings together gender equality experts from developing agencies to define better policies and programming. Jenny has also worked on gender equality and women's rights in development in the OECD as an advisor in France's Ministry for Foreign Affairs and seconded Ghana's Ministry of Women and Children. Then we have Landon Wilcock. He is the Associate Economic Affairs Officer at UNSSE. He works at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development on the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, where he works at the intersection of sustainable finance, climate policy, and gender equality. He brings significant experience advising senior government officials on policy, including during his time as a senior policy advisor in the Canadian government and at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where he supported political leaders across the Asia and Pacific and contributed to preparations for COP28. His work spans multilateral development, energy transition strategy, high-level policy engagement. Then last but not least, we have Antonia Sariska from UBS. She's Sustainable Impact Investing and Strategy from UBS Global Wealth Management. She's super excited about what is helping the impact investing market to grow. She's a daughter of Bulgarian engineers, raised in Russia and educated in UK, Belgium, Singapore, and France, and she has been part of the impact conversation since the early days of her career. As a sustainable and impact investing strategist for UBS Global Wealth Management's Chief Investment Office in Zurich, she observes how investor attitudes are changing. So now I'll hand over to the floor to Jenny for her presentation. So Jenny, over to you.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. I wanted to start by taking just 1 minute to tell you where I'm coming from and kind of set the scene of what this presentation is about. So I work, as has been said, at the OECD in our Development Cooperation Directorate. So that's the good slide. And we support the Development Assistance Committee, the DAC. We provide the secretariat to this committee that is made up of the 33 donor countries that are members of the DAC. We develop and provide good practice analysis and standards on development cooperation and on development cooperation for gender equality specifically. So we have a DAC recommendation, we have DAC guidance on gender equality, and we have a DAC recommendation on ending sexual exploitation as well. So those are documents that the 33 DAC members have adopted and committed to implementing. We do peer learning and exchange on development cooperation and gender equality in the DAC network on gender equality, the Gender Net, which brings together gender and development experts. And we track and analyze development finance, including for gender equality, using the DAC gender equality policy marker, which I will come back to. So that last and third point is, of course, what this presentation is about today. So we can move on to the next slide, which shows you kind of a tentative mapping of the development finance landscape as we see it as relevant for gender equality. It gives you a sense of the sort of landscape, and there are probably other different ways of showing this, but this is how we opted to do it. So if we start in the upper right-hand side corner of this square here, you'll see that that is about commercial finance. It can be about purely commercial finance, but it's also about social impact investing and investments with a gender lens that recognizes that these are smart investments that can both help increase returns and contribute to leaving no one behind in countries. Then we also have in that kind of on that right-hand side in the box there, of course, we have private philanthropy, which is another type of private cross-border flow that can support gender equality. And then there are many modalities where private actors can work together with governments and with public flows. So that is exactly that box in the middle there where it says blended finance. It can be public-private partnerships, mobilizing private finance through public official flows. Then if we go all the way to the left-hand side, still at the top of that box, this is funding, international funding by members of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee and also multilateral organizations and banks. So that's about official development assistance, ODA, and other types of international flows that might not qualify as ODA. So that can be export credits, funds in support of private investments, some guarantees, etc. And of course, all of these flows can, and we think should be, addressing gender inequalities. Then if we look at the bottom half of the square, that is about domestic, so countries' own resources, financial management, their fiscal space, and also the private sector that is in countries. I won't be talking necessarily so much about that bottom half today, but mainly keep to the upper half of the square. So that's the international public and some private finance, mainly because this is where the OECD has data available and where we do analysis in the OECD's Development Cooperation Directorate. So we can move on to the next slide.
Jenny, somebody is asking if you could speak a bit louder.
I can speak a bit louder, and I'm going to see if I can keep my microphone a little bit closer to my mouth. Sorry about that. Okay, so this chart shows you bilateral ODA from the 33 members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the DAC. So how do we track this money and also other types of international development flows? Well, at the OECD, a large number of countries and institutions report their development finance to us. And when they do that, we ask them to use the DAC gender equality policy marker to tell us, does the finance focus on gender equality, yes or no? So if yes, we ask them, is gender equality the main dedicated objective of your financing or your investment? That is the purple part that you see in these bars on this chart. So you see that that is quite a small share overall. Or It can also be that gender equality is an integrated or mainstreamed objective. It is one of other policy objectives with the financing or with the investment. That is the orange part of this chart. So that is a little bit more money that we're talking about here. And you see that it's more and more money over the years. It is increasing. Or if gender equality is maybe not at all an objective, not at all taken into account, then that is the gray part exactly of those bars in that chart there. So what we're finding is that in 2023, 46% of bilateral ODA had some type of gender equality objectives. That amounted to approximately $69 billion US. So about 69 billion of ODA had some type of gender equality objectives in 2023. So these data from 2023 are verified and official OECD data. Now, we realize that today many are interested in what is happening in 2024 and 2025. So my colleagues have been doing some work on this. And what we know is that in 2024, preliminary ODA data showed that ODA from DAC member countries declined for the first time in 6 years. It fell by 7.1%. So now I'm talking about ODA overall. I'm not talking about ODA for gender equality. The overall ODA fell in 2024. And looking further ahead, recent announcement by some DAC members have raised concerns about future levels of overall ODA further declining with budgetary cuts. So the OECD has made some simulations of ODA in 2025, and they show that ODA is likely to drop between 9 and 17% from 2024 to 2025. So again, that is overall ODA. We're not yet talking about gender equality because we don't have those details, but clearly overall we see that ODA is declining, and how much depends on kind of different scenarios that my statistical colleagues have developed, and they will keep working on this, and we will be able to provide something in writing from the OECD in the near future. So taking us back to the kind of verified official 2023 flows, we can, thank you, exactly, go to that slide, which is ODA broken down by DAC member. So this chart shows you the share of ODA by each DAC member with gender equality objectives. So this is not US dollars. This is the share of each country's total ODA. And you can see that we have there Netherlands, Ireland, Belgium, Iceland, Switzerland at the top in 2023. Then we can go to the next slide and look a little bit at where official development assistance went when it comes to sectors, thematic areas. So again, let me remind you, when you look at this, the gray parts of these charts, of these bars, is where the money is lacking a gender equality focus. So if you look at the size of the bars here and the humanitarian assistance bar, which is the third bar there exactly from the top, you see that there's a lot of gray in there, meaning that there's quite a lot of money. There's a lot of humanitarian aid that do not integrate gender equality objectives. So we are keeping quite a close eye on that sector and discussing this with our members quite a lot, thinking about how can we increase the gender equality focus in humanitarian assistance. Similarly, with governance, that's the very top bar there, you see that there's a lot of gray, meaning there's a lot of money that goes to the governance sector, but not focusing at all on gender equality. That particular bar is actually a lot of money to Ukraine. In the past couple of years, a lot of money has gone to Ukraine. A lot of that has been in the governance sector, and a lot of that has not had gender equality objectives. So again, that's something that we discuss with our members quite a lot. And the third sector I wanted to highlight as one that has a very low gender equality focus is energy, where we also see over the years that really members are struggling to integrate gender equality into that thematic area. And then there are other areas such as education or social protection, etc., where we see that it's a little bit easier for DAC members to actually work on gender equality. And then also one other point that's not on this slide, but I just wanted to tell you, because at one point we did an analysis looking at different countries and money going to different countries and looking at the levels of inequality in different countries and how the kind of gender equality focus of ODA corresponded to the level of gender inequality that you could measure in countries. And what we saw that there was really no clear correlation between the two. So that was quite interesting as well. It's something that we can, I think, continue to work on. Now, let's move on to the next slide, which is no longer about official development assistance. I wanted to move us beyond that now. If you think back to that first figure I showed you, that box with 4 boxes within it, we're now in the right-hand upper corner, which is private flows, private international flows, because these charts show you private flows mobilized by DAC members. So this is money that has been reported to us by members of the OECD DAC, but it is the private finance that they mobilized through their public finance. So in 2023, DAC members reported having mobilized about $15 billion of private finance overall. Out of that, about a third, $5 billion included gender equality objectives. So that was in 2023. So this money, this private finance mobilized with gender equality objective, it was mobilized, for example, using shares in collective investment vehicles or using guarantees. So we saw, just looking in our database, I had a quick look in our database, and we can see that there are, for example, funds in Latin America and the Caribbean on gender diversity and inclusion. There is the Southeast Asian Women's Economic Empowerment Fund, where there was public funding and private funding mobilized that went to that. Another example is the Responsibility Climate Smart Agriculture and Food Systems Fund, which invests in gender diverse agribusinesses. So all of those sort of funds were funded through public funds and mobilized private finance. I think that shows just some interesting examples of really positive types of financing vehicles. So then we can go to my very last slide, which is the other piece of the kind of private finance puzzle, which is private philanthropy, because we do have over 40 private foundations that report their financial cross-border flows to the OECD's Development Cooperation Directorate. So on this slide, what you see here is in green, money that does not have gender equality objectives at all. And the yellow, orange, I guess, and dark blue parts of these bars show money, which includes gender equality objectives to some extent. So in total, about $4 billion of private philanthropic flows had gender equality objectives in 2023, and quite a lot of that was in the health and population sectors. So I am going to stop there, but I just wanted to tell you that all of these data are actually now available on our website. We have made a dashboard, an online dashboard, that allows you also to play around with these data and looking at countries and sectors, etc. So I'll be happy to share the link to that online dashboard. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for that amazing presentation. We've learned a lot, and we have a lot of comments and questions on the chat. So if we can remind you, if you have any questions, please do ask them on the Q&A box so they can get answered during the Q&A session. With that said, I'd like to invite Landon from UNSSE to the floor. So Landon, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Miwa. And I'm excited to be here with you all today to talk more about financing for gender equality. A really great presentation and some really interesting data from Jenny. It was very interesting to see ODA targeted towards gender equality objectives, as well as the data on private flows mobilized. Hopefully my presentation is complementary as it dives a bit more into the private side of finance products that target gender equality. But before that, and briefly to start, I'm a member of the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative team, and in brief, we're a global platform that aims to help stock exchanges alongside investors, companies, policymakers, and regulators enhance performance on ESG and encourage sustainable investment, including financing of the SDGs, which would, of course, encompass SDG 5. We can go to the next slide, please. So I think naturally, or it's natural for a lot of folks to not be totally aware of or see the complete importance of the role of stock exchanges in the financial system, specifically when it comes to advancing gender equality. So I want to highlight just a few ways that exchanges do and can play a key role here. First, exchanges can promote gender-themed bonds and ETFs and other gender-themed products, which can advance gender equality through impactful investments, assuming those investments are made impactfully, which is a bigger conversation we'll get into a little bit today. Another key market-focused action is encouraging gender diversity in companies through listing rules. This is something here at the UNSSE we also track. This is a part of our Women in Corporate Leadership reports, which I'll share the link to after I'm done speaking. Exchanges can also support data disclosure and benchmarking. Often when we're talking about advancing gender equality in the private markets, data disclosure and benchmarking comes up time and time again, and the need for data transparency and disclosure is so important because it needs to be measured and monitored, or else it's likely not to have changes made, unfortunately. I'll note internally, exchanges can also set strong gender equality policies, targets, and report transparently to set an example for their market. And in the broader ecosystem, stock exchanges can help to shape market norms through standards and guidance for issuers. Another key role to play is using their networks to provide training and capacity building for market participants and other stakeholders within their market. To sum up, I'll just say all of those actions together can help achieve more responsible investment, as well as supporting efforts in a market to advance gender equality. We can go to the next slide, please. Great. So as mentioned, I want to I touched a bit on gender-themed products, and I want to discuss that in a bit more detail and present some findings with you from a forthcoming report we're launching in partnership with UN Women and the IFC on gender-themed financial products. Quick caveat that this is a sneak peek and we're still finalizing the document and some research with some of the partners involved. But there's a lot of interesting things to discuss within this topic, so we'll dive in. To start, we looked with a simple research question. So we talk about gender-focused finance a lot, especially more and more in recent years, but what does the actual landscape look like? What instruments out there are being used in financial markets? So we did exactly this, and we conducted a landscape scan of gender-themed financial products. With that, we were using different databases, Bloomberg, MSCI, and also looking through a lot of various information. And essentially, we identified these core 11 different financial product types. And then the forthcoming report provides some in-depth analysis into 5 of the types, covering these 5 asset categories. So we collected data on product type, geographic distribution. Is it a developed versus emerging markets according to UN classification, the country or exchange of a product, the asset value, market share, and perhaps most interestingly, alignment of that product to the women's empowerment principles, or the WEPs. So we'll go a bit more into the preliminary findings of this work, and we'll go to the next slide for that. So what we see here is there's a fair degree of alignment with the women's empowerment principles, or the WEPs. So I would definitely classify this as good news, with a lot of alignment found between the products. But you can, of course, see some alignment was stronger in certain WEPs or principles than others. Okay, we can note here as well There's more of a focus on leadership and equal treatment. So most products emphasize WEP 1, leadership, or WEP 2, equal opportunity and treatment. Well, you can see WEPs 5 and 6 on enterprise development and supply chain, as well as community advocacy, receive a little less attention per se. We can go to the next slide, please. What we also found was that many financial products lack explicit WEPs alignment disclosures, which makes impact assessment and progress tracking difficult. But corporate bonds often were higher in leadership, which we found interesting. And we often also saw that across the board. I'll note here, you can see, again, the good news that for knowledge products, which we consider to be market benchmarks and indices, over half of all those gender-themed knowledge products were aligned with the WEPs. So that was very positive to see. I'll also note here, interestingly, that there were some maybe what we'll call market leaders. For example, the Equileap Gender Equality Scorecard was used by 39 of the 102 gender equity indices. They measure leadership diversity, pay equity, and workplace policies. There are other, of course, similar products to the Equileap Gender Equality Scorecard, but you can see some products really dominating the market. We can go to the next slide, please. And back to government and corporate bonds WEPs alignment. You can see here that, as noted, corporate bonds were often higher in WEPs alignment to leadership. And we often saw in documents the leadership focus as well is on the number of women boards, number of women on boards or women CEOs or CFOs. So within that, even that WEP, there's a really a key focus just on those specific metrics. We also see that, sorry. Yeah, we can go to the next slide, please. So this is probably one of the more interesting parts of the research. So here, what we did was we looked at how these products, or specifically the corporate and government bonds, aligned or referenced the SDGs in financial documents. So we just went through the WEPs alignment, but then on SDGs, we saw across the 17 SDGs, gender bonds frequently align with SDG 5, which you can see really called out here. But this is obviously a positive thing, and we should consider it as such. But Anna noted in her opening remarks on how a lot of financing is not targeted or targeted enough to gender equality. And this is actually another data point for this, because as you can see here, these are bonds listed here that are considered as gender bonds. But as I'm sure you can all see, almost, let's say, 15 of the SDGs are all quite heavily referenced in what are considered to be gender bond documents. And SDG 5 is actually kind of caught in the middle or quite average in terms of references as compared to all these other SDGs. So it's an interesting discussion and piece to think about that these are quote unquote gender focused bonds, but really their focus is spread across all the SDGs. And the SDG they're supposed to be focused on, SDG 5, is not actually the front runner in terms of how they're referenced. We can go to the next slide, please. So with that, we have some key findings and recommendations. So it's still a niche market, and there's a dominance of benchmarking instruments that we see. So those are the indices and knowledge products. So there's a lot more knowledge products and benchmarking tools versus, say, ETFs, etc. We do see a lot more emerging market activity in the bonds. Equity funds were lagging behind. There is far less equity funds in the market that are gender themed. And then there's data transparency and standardization challenges. A key issue stemming from this ambiguity surrounding what qualifies as a gender-themed financial product is at the core of the issue. So while gender bonds, gender-themed funds, and other instruments exist, there's often not a universally accepted standard or definition that dictates the eligibility criteria for inclusion in their respective product class. I will say a lot of great organizations do have very good definitions and criteria, but it's that universal acceptance piece that I think is key. And then I will note as well that gender-themed financial products often fail to provide standardized key performance indicators or KPIs that would enable investors to assess the real-world effects of their instruments. Some issuers do report on gender-themed impact post-issuance, for example, for bonds, but the level of data and rigor varies widely and information is not easily accessible. I will note and shout out the Luxembourg Stock Exchange here. They have a gender bonds database. So there are efforts being made to increase the data transparency. But in this report, we support an open database that can be easily accessed by anyone involved in the market. So with that, our recommendations, we recommend developing standardized gender finance taxonomies, enhancing reporting and transparency, expanding investment in gender-themed products, strengthening policy and regulation, addressing risks of gender washing. And on that, I will note it's similar to what probably everyone is aware of in terms of greenwashing and environmental finance. But going back to the first recommendation of taxonomies, we see a lack of a social taxonomy, which can increase the risk of quote unquote gender washing. So one of the primary drivers of gender washing is the absence of stringent regulatory requirements for gender-themed financial disclosures. So many financial products can use gender-themed terminology or marketing, such as being a women's leadership fund or a gender bond, without actually providing clear evidence of how those instruments are contributing to advancing gender equality. For instance, some index funds marketed as gender lens investments merely overweight companies with a higher proportion of women on boards, but then don't consider broader workplace equity, pay transparency, pay equity, direct funding for women-led enterprises, amongst other important issues within advancing gender equality. And that can create a disconnect between investor expectations and actual impact of those products. And then, as mentioned, there have been efforts to establish a gender finance taxonomy, notably with the European Union, but this has not yet been launched into the market. It's been a bit caught up. So they did the EU platform on sustainable finance's final report on social taxonomy and the IISD both advocated the urgent need for standardized classifications. But the issue is until such a framework is fully developed and adopted globally, investors will continue to face challenges in identifying and supporting credible gender-themed financial products. So we say without taxonomies, the investors lack a clear definition of what qualifies as a gender-themed financial product. And we think that's really a root issue. If we don't have the standard definitions and the taxonomies in place, that kind of needs to be the bottom layer of the pyramid on which everything else is built upon. So hopefully that's an interesting overview. As mentioned, this report is forthcoming alongside another report on gender equality metrics. So those reports are expected to be launched in about a week or 10 days time. So I really encourage you to check them out once they're live. And thank you for the overview or listening to my overview. And then the last slide, tools and resources. I don't have enough time to get into details of all the various tools we have at the SSE to guide market participants on gender equality. But at the UNSSE, we do have a lot of tools and resources on gender equality for capital markets. So we have consensus building events and webinars. We produce guidance for exchanges and market participants, research and data. As well, we have SSE Academy, which trains upwards of 10,000 individuals a year on sustainability disclosures as well as gender equality training. So I encourage you to check out the SSE website. I'll put the link in after this. And as mentioned, please look out for the gender themed products report as well as the upcoming gender metrics report. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you so much, Landon. That is very exciting and happy to see that WEPs is being referred a lot and being aligned with lots of products. So with that said, we are going to now move on to a different format. So we are going to invite Anna and Antonia to really host a conversation about how private sector UBS as a web signatory is working on this issue. So with that said, I'd like to invite Anna and Antonia to the floor. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Miwa, and welcome also to Antonia. I thought maybe, Antonia, you could just say hello, introduce yourself, and a little bit about UBS, who you are and what you're doing.
Of course, thank you very much. And I think Miwa did a great introduction in the beginning, but maybe just briefly about UBS as well. As you know, UBS is a large global bank. We have wealth management business, which is our advisory for high net worth individuals, families, family offices, which is the core of our activity globally. And then in addition to that, we have an asset management arm that essentially develops investment funds that help us allocate capital. We have an investment bank, and in Switzerland specifically, we also have a universal retail bank. So it's a really, really broad spectrum of activities that UBS covers. As part of that, we manage about $300 billion in sustainable and impact investments across the bank. Some of them address gender lens investments as well, which is something that we're very, very happy about. And every year, what we do is we take a bit of a stock in terms of, how far we've come or how far gender lens investments have progressed. And we usually publish a report around International Women's Day just to help highlight some of the challenges, but also opportunities that sit in front of us. And I think the reason why we all got connected today is because just this year we published something on kind of 25 years into this century, so to say, and how far women have come and the role of private capital. So looking forward on exchanging on that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Antonia, for that introduction. So maybe we could start talking a little bit about what does gender lens investing actually mean in practice?
Yeah,
and you could elaborate.
Yeah, and that's really the crux of the discussion here. And I think both from Jenny and Landon, we did hear some of the commentary around, can we align around definitions? Can we align around frameworks? How can we start talking the same language and the same taxonomy? And I'm not sure how helpful UBS has been on that, because when we think of gender lens investments, we actually think of three different pillars. We call them investments for women, investments in women, and investments by women. And maybe I can briefly mention about what some of those mean, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a glance into how wide the spectrum of gender lens investments has expanded, both in order to address something that Landon has pointed out, which is investability, right? To what extent can we push the boundaries in terms of capital allocation? But also in order to cater to the different understandings of what gender progress or gender equality could mean for investors. So maybe if I briefly mention a couple of examples, when we talk about investments for women, we mostly focus on companies whose products and services aim to address women as consumers, in a sense that, how can we equip the women with the skills that are necessary, with the knowledge, with the resources that are necessary in order to get an equal economic opportunity. So we're talking about education, we're talking about financial inclusion, we're talking about healthcare services where women tend to be often disadvantaged. In investments in women, it's probably the one that comes closest to a kind of the traditional sense of gender lens investments. So in other words, can we favor companies where women are finding leadership role equality, equal pay, can we support female entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. So that's the in women. And investments by women has to do with how can we help women once they have accumulated some kind of economic resource, then take care of their own financial future. And that means things like pensions, for example, but also investments, of course, once they're ready to participate in the broader capital markets. So 3 different lenses to gender lens investments pushes the boundary a little bit, but I also recognize sometimes creates a bit of a wider taxonomy question, I think, for all of us in the industry.
No, thank you. And you are kind of indeed, we are coming from different lenses, but I think our realities are also quite different. So thank you for that. So how are investors measuring gender impact and returns? A little bit on the measurement.
Yeah, measurement in our view needs to be really investment specific. So depending on what type of investments we are making and how we're defining our gender lens objective, their measurement will be different. So for example, if I think about our investments for activities, investments for women activities, then we're really going to focus on, are we serving an underserved population of women? So are we providing, let's say, access to healthcare, to fertility healthcare, maternal healthcare, etc., to a group of women that otherwise wouldn't have had access to it? When we talk about things like financial inclusion, right, we're thinking about bank accounts, but also opportunity for women to get financing, to get mortgages for their own, home ownership and so on and so forth, where otherwise they wouldn't have been able to. So we are really thinking about populations of women as a measurement. If I think, however, in our investments in women, I think that's where I think maybe some of the industry has still struggled to try to define what will be a meaningful metric there. I think in the broader investment space, we're quite used to measuring things like gender equality of leadership teams and management teams. We're quite used to measuring things like, what percentage of our portfolio companies are owned by a female owner, for example, a female entrepreneur. But in reality, that doesn't give us yet the exact kind of measurement of progress, the so what, okay, we've now achieved this percentage of leadership, let's say, but how does that help advance the next generation of female leaders and so on? So I think that's a place where I think investors are still struggling a little bit with understanding what these metrics mean. You also mentioned returns, and I think returns is such an interesting topic because in our observation of financial returns, and we are an investor that targets market rate investment returns. So we want to make sure that within a certain asset class, let's say an equity investment, we want to get a similar return that what we would have received in our non-gender lens investments as well. And I think there what we have noticed is that we have not compromised on returns, but also we need to be very cognizant of the market environment. And here is maybe where I can give a very technical investment example, where if we are selecting, let's say, companies with a high representation of female leaders, publicly traded companies, and we take equity stakes, so we buy stocks of those companies, very often we end up in industries, in specific set of industries. So if you look at the data, women tend to be more represented in, consumer discretionary, in healthcare, in financial services, and so on and so forth. So there's a set of industries that just happen to have a high representation of women. So from a returns perspective, you end up in a situation where you're investing in a certain subset of the market instead of the broader market, and that means there will be risk and volatility throughout the market cycle. Now, over a whole market cycle, you end up in a very similar place to where you would have ended with a traditional portfolio. But we just need to be cognizant that there will be certain sort of year-on-year fluctuations in these type of investments, just purely because of maybe some of the concentration that is happening.
Very, very interesting. So what are the biggest challenges in mobilizing capital for gender equality?
Yeah, I think quite a few of the challenges I think were mentioned already. Maybe one thing that I would point out, and just going back to the topic of investability, is maybe the challenge that we have in terms of mobilizing capital for broader social outcomes in general, right? I think the first one that I would point out is that investors have traditionally struggled to access very specific opportunities in emerging markets. And we know that's where, in many cases, the largest gaps are. So emerging frontier markets where investors are often exposed to environment markets companies where they have very limited knowledge, but also where they have to face different currencies, different types of risks that they're not familiar with. And this is where partnering with local players, with the local ecosystem, with local intermediaries, NGOs, advocacy groups, and so on and so forth has really helped, I think, get a bit more comfortable with some of those projects on the ground. Still, they remain relatively small in size. So the question is, how can we scale those? And I think that remains still a bit of a challenge that the financial services industry is trying to address. I think the second challenge, again, I would point out metrics and measurement. And I wouldn't necessarily think of it as I think data quality is improving out there. So we know the data will never be perfect, but at least we're having increasingly more data out there in the market. The question is, can we make a meaningful interpretation of that data? Can we actually understand whether that brings us closer or further away from the investment objective? So that's probably the second one. It's more of a social science type of question in terms of, we've accumulated all of that data and metrics. Can we actually understand where we're moving the needle, where we're not moving the needle, what else needs to happen? And that almost takes a social science type of approach, more so than an investment approach.
Interesting. I think it's a very important point that you're raising here with the metrics and measurement. We have recently done a survey with our web signatories, and I think they are not fully there in tracking and reporting on data. So that is the main focus of us as a web secretariat this year, is to really move the needle among our web signatories to make sure they understand the importance. It is not only to have the data, but it is used by many, many stakeholders, including investors, but also those that might be interested in understanding better these companies as suppliers and in other form in the market. So thanks very much for raising that. So then how do frameworks like the WEPs help influence investment policy?
Yeah, I think the principles are very helpful in terms of informing the development of those investment policies. I think different investors will have a different set of criteria in terms of how they look at gender lens investments and what matters to them in kind of gender, as we said, right? For example, with us, with our 3 dimensions. But where the principles come in handy is really helping an investors get a bit of a roadmap of what that framework is going to look like. So what are some of the key focus areas that they need to be paying attention to? What is actually meaningful in the broader scheme of us trying to solve for gender equality? And then what is the granularity that they will get to as part of their own investment policy? I think that's down to an investor. And obviously, there are investors like ourselves that go into a lot greater detail, but then there are also investors like families or family offices that would say, look, it doesn't need to be as complicated. I just need to know that I'm putting money to work. And they might really stay at the principles level and not break it further down. But I think where the WEPs are really, really helpful is in giving us a bit of a roadmap of, here are the building blocks that we need to be thinking about. Here are, where where the most critical pain points are, so to say, on our journey. And then it's down to the investor to take those principles and turn them into an actual investment policy that will then have criteria, data points, decision-making process, and so on and so forth attached to it.
Thank you. And we are actually approached by a number of investors that also want to know which are the companies that have signed on to the Women's Empowerment Principles. Who are those that have made this commitment to embark on the gender equality journey? And that is why we also pushing for data and accountability, so that we also help our web signatories to attract those investments. So that leads me to the final question for now, before we go into the participants' questions. How can SMEs attract gender lens capital?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, and I wish I had the silver bullet. But when we are looking, for example, at our investees, and even if they're outside of our gender lens portfolios, we do pay attention to the diversity of those teams, and we do pay attention to the diversity of the customer base and to what extent product development or solutions development takes into account the needs of different consumer groups that might be underrepresented, for example, women. And I think we encourage companies to be more transparent about those practices. Of course, for many of them, measurement and reporting might be a costly endeavor, especially if they're early stage companies or smaller projects. So doing costly measurement for the sake of measurement is not what we would advise. But really trying to give a bit more transparency on how they live the diversity journey, what are some of the things that they take into account when they think about the diversity of their own teams, or the way their products address diverse groups of consumers. That's very, very helpful to investors to understand.
Great. So we will now go into the next segment. So I invite Landon and Jenny to join us in this conversation. And we have a lot of questions, both in the chat, and I encourage those that have put it in the chat to please put it in the Q&A function so we can better distill which ones are the questions for the panelists versus just comment to the broader group. There was a very interesting question, but I think you have already responded it in some way or another. But in case you want to add something else, which is kind of a fundamental question, should women's rights become financial products? And maybe it explained a little bit with Antonia what we're actually talking about when we are talking about women's rights within financial products, and also Landon, but maybe you'd like to elaborate some more. There was also a number of questions related to, Jenny, the gender marker. If you could maybe unpack a little bit what the KPIs are, if any, under the various, particularly the main objectives. So that was a few questions on that. What does that actually mean to be a main objective, to be gender mainstreamed or not reflected? So those elements of the different gender marker. And also there was a question on like, why is the main objective so low? What are the fundamental reasons behind that? And lots of questions. So I would just take one more for now. There was a question to you, Landon, also on the data that you presented was now kind of aggregate level. Does any of the reports that you have issued or are planning to issue available for specific countries that people can delve into their own countries and try to understand the market and the financial products in their particular country? So I would just stop here now, and then we'll go to, oh, actually, let me take another one because I think it was interesting also to maybe more to Antonia, but the successful models of gender lens investing in low resource rural context in the global south, and anything else that you can talk about gender lens investing that reaches the global south. Yeah, I'll start with maybe with Jenny, and then we take a round, and then we go to the next few questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for all of those questions. That's great. So yes, thank you, Anna. I'll pick up on everything you said, and then maybe I think I saw maybe one or two others also related to similar sort of the marker. So on the DAC gender equality policy marker criteria, indeed, we do have a handbook with a set of criteria. So again, happy to provide a link for those of you who are interested in the kind of technical details around that. But just to say that for financing to qualify as having gender equality objectives, a gender analysis needs to have been conducted. Findings from the analysis needs to have informed the design. There needs to be gender equality objectives in the program documentation. Data and indicators should be disaggregated by sex, and there should be a commitment to monitor and report on gender equality. And then we have that level difference if it is the dedicated objective And then if that is the case, what we ask is basically, would the program or the investment have happened without gender equality? Yes or no? That's kind of the easy way of putting it, or kind of, I find that quite an illustrative way of thinking about it. So would that even have taken place if it wasn't for gender equality? So if no, then it is a dedicated objective, if that's sort of the reason for existing for that financing. But we do have some more information and documentation around that, which I can share with you. The gender marker has been around since the 1990s. It's a standard tool of the OECD's creditor reporting system, along with other policy marker. We do have a large number of countries and institutions using it and reporting against it. So I think it's quite a good example of a metric that I feel is sufficiently simplistic in a way for many to be able to use it, and yet sufficiently kind of complex to provide us with some detail and some sort of analytical depth to it. And I did want to just make one point on that, because we were talking about metrics kind of and gender lens investing. We are actually working with the 2X challenge, which you may be familiar with, which is a collaborative doing gender lens investing as well, and thinking together with them a little bit, comparing their gender lens investing criteria with the DAC gender marker and trying to translate a little bit across the communities, because it's true that the DAC marker, it's the development cooperation community. So that started with the members of the DAC, and those are the ones, that's kind of the language we're using, tends to be adapted to them. Whereas when it comes to gender lens investing, we use other words and we take slightly different approaches. So sometimes it's also a matter of just understanding each other. So we're trying to work with them as well, and kind of helping each other understand what we're talking about. So also from our perspective, more actors are able to use the DAC gender equality policy marker. And then I just wanted to pick up, someone was asking around about the impact kind of that the marker has had and can have. And I would argue that the marker has been extremely important over the past really couple of decades, because there is that saying of what gets measured gets managed. And I think that's really true, because we have been able to pinpoint, especially when it comes to specific members of the DAC, we've been able to say, hey, you are actually below average here, and you're saying that you have a gender equality as a priority. So why are you below the average? Then maybe you need to do a little bit better. So it's really a very helpful tool, I think, for the kind of advocacy community, and also for researchers, and for also staff within governments and within institutions who are able to use the data and compare themselves. Why are the shares of gender-focused aid so low with a dedicated objective? Honestly, I think this is something that we have been thinking about discussing for a long, long time. It remains around 4 to 5% of total bilateral ODA, and it doesn't seem to ever go beyond that. I think that it is probably around political and policy priorities. I think it's as simple as that, and I think it's about continuing to make the case for gender equality and the importance of dedicated programs to gender equality. And maybe a little bit linked to that, just picking up on that point of should women's rights be financial products? I think, I mean, others are better placed than me to explain exactly what we're talking about there. But I think just the point I wanted to make, I feel it's quite important when we talk about these issues, and I think private finance and innovative finance are really good opportunities for women and for gender equality, right? But I also kind of want to make the case for a little bit for ODA, because I do think that it's important to safeguard public aid for gender equality as well, along with private finance, because I think there are areas of women's rights and gender equality where we'll see aid will continue to be needed, such as funding for local feminist organizations and feminist movements. I think that it's really important for all of us as a community to keep that in mind, that remains important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And I saw also somebody was saying in the chat that the gender marker has been adapted to municipal level. And we also know web signatories that have been using the gender marker to be able to categorize, particularly its programming in local communities, both from the philanthropic end, but also in engagement as a company in the local community, to make sure, because as we said earlier, data are eye-opening for what is reality and what is perceptions. So Landon, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Anna. And to start, I just wanted to speak quickly on that first question about gender rights being associated with financial products. It's an important question. So I would say including women's rights into these financial products that I discussed, whether that be an ETF, a gender bond, etc., can make gender equality investable, which takes this moral imperative of equal gender rights and human rights and also presents an additional market opportunity where when investors back products that advance women's rights like gender bonds, ETFs, etc., they're supporting a social good, but they're also tapping into other factors like untapped market potential. There's a report, I think Nielsen IQ came out in April, noting how women control more than 31 trillion in global spending. And with this, economies grow faster, companies perform better when women are participating equally in the market. There's also an element of risk mitigation where gender inequality is also a material risk for companies. We've seen companies that ignore gender issues face higher reputational, legal, and operational risks as well. And I think Antonia, if she speaks to this, because I think she'll do a far better job, but there is also market incentive as products, including gender equality in their frameworks, can show really strong financial returns. And there's increasingly more and more evidence that investing in women's leadership, entrepreneurship, inclusion can help drive profit, and that these gender diverse companies also tend to outperform their peers. And lastly, I'll just note there's an element as well of scalability through capital markets, where embedding women's rights into financial products can allow institutional capital to scale solutions far beyond what just philanthropy or policy alone can and should do. So those are just a few scattered thoughts on that big question. It's an interesting question, but hopefully those are a few quick answers or thoughts on it. And then very briefly to the question about the upcoming SSE report on gender-themed financial products. We do a company level. Our data goes into our data goes into country level data. So there is some data on different regions and countries. I think the question was specifically about Jordan, perhaps. I can't off the top of my head remember the Jordan landscape, but please watch for that report coming in the next week or two, and you will see some country level analysis in it.
Thank you. Antonia?
Sure, and maybe I'll pick up on a couple of things that both Jenny and Landon mentioned. And it kind of links back into the question on using financial products to address this space, but also on the question around Global South. And I think one of the important messages, I guess, that come from this discussion here is that different types of initiatives or different parts of the ecosystem of gender lens investments would need different types of capital. There is no one single type of capital that will solve for all of the elements. We still need, as we said, ODA, we still need philanthropy, we still need to be able to get things off the ground that might not necessarily be commercial business models, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be on the ground. They're actually very instrumental to what's happening in the gender lens ecosystem more broadly. So I think we need to be always cognizant of that. And maybe a couple of examples I would give is, we have a corporate foundation called the UBS Optimus Foundation, but we also work with other philanthropic organizations. And some of the things that we are very cognizant of in our broader ecosystem is what are some of the projects or some of the investees that would actually benefit from a philanthropy first, so to say, type of capital. So a philanthropist coming in and saying, look, I'm willing to take the bulk of the risk and I'm willing to bring in some capital in order to help commercial commercial investors that come and look for less risk to actually be incentivized to come in and finance the scalability of this project, the scalability of this technology, and so on and so forth. So that's blended finance, but can also have other types of structures. And I think that's probably at the moment the most effective way to address some of the challenges we have in the global south, because like I said, I think the biggest challenge is that a commercial investor that only puts their commercial hat on and they say, I have $1 of investment, and that $1 of investment is going to go to gender lens, but it's also cognizant on the risk that I'm willing to take, because I'm not a philanthropist, I'm a commercial investor, then most likely that $1 of investment is not going to go to the global south type of investment or emerging or frontier market because of the level of risk. And that's where we need ODA, we need philanthropists, we need the broader development finance community to come and help build, maybe through technical assistance or other mechanisms, build that trust into the ecosystem, build that de-risking mechanism to allow a commercial investor to come in. Another example I will give is a lot of the work that's being done on outcomes-based finance. So maybe something that we have done or our foundation arm has done is partnerships in India around education of girls. So early stage education, classroom early stage education of girls, where they have partnered with the local government of Rajasthan, as well as a local NGO called Educate Girls. And essentially the local government was the de-risking partner there, in a sense that they say, look, if you and Educate Girls are able to get to certain outcomes, a certain number of girls that have now consistently attended this education program, that are graduating from these classes and so on and so forth, then we are willing to pay whatever the interest on the bond is, whatever the interest on the financing was at that point in time. So coming in as the guarantor for those outcomes. Again, an element of blending, an element of de-risking enables commercial investors or maybe more returns oriented investors to go into, although India is no longer, I guess, a difficult market for investments, has become a lot more transparent in recent years, but come into a market that they might not be as familiar with, but then focus on a very specific project. So that's just a couple of examples. But like I said, I think that the challenge there would be how can we rally the ecosystem, and $1 of finance would be a different $1 of finance depending on what we're trying to do. And that's where we need to think in the broader picture, as opposed to here is just one company or just one investment, and is that investment worth it or not? It's about how it fits in the broader picture.
Thank you. So we only actually have 4 minutes left. And we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to just kind of throw a few of those questions out that I think could be interesting, but also to ask each of you if you have any particular recommendation that you'd like to give to the participants. And then we will have a summary of the conversation today, along with the recording that will be posted on our website. And Miwa, there's also been questions, if you could bring back the slide afterwards on the QR code for LinkedIn. But the questions are quite interesting. I mean, all of them are very interesting, and unfortunately, we don't have time to take all of them. But there is something around any observations that you've had around the D&I backlash and trends in financing for gender equality from all dimensions, from the 3 perspectives that you've been sharing. And a particular question also, I think we can broaden it to all of you. What is your motivation of focusing on gender equality through financing and genderless investing? And if anyone would like to add something on the procurement as a role of driving capital to women-owned business. And then any recommendation that you have, and then we will go in and close. So we have not even a minute each, so please be brief. And we can start with you, Antonia, and then we go to Landon and end with Jenny. You're muted. Okay, you'll fix it, and we go to Landon in the meantime.
Yeah, recognizing we're running out of time, so
Yeah.
I'll comment very briefly on what I think is actually probably the most important question of those. Not that they're not all important questions, but just that my perspective or kind of my motivation. So I would just say, especially to all the men involved in this discussion, gender equality isn't just a woman's issue; it's a systemic-wide issue that affects, the efficiency, fairness, obviously equitability, sustainability of the global economy. So I personally focus on gender equality investing in a part of my role because I want to be a part of building capital markets that reward value creation, not just for men as they historically have done so, but for all involved. And, there's many aspects of those who are not involved in the market or are unfairly involved in the market, etc. And the data is quite clear that companies and funds that empower women tend to perform better as well. So you can take an economic lens to it, you can take a moral, human rights lens to it, but whatever it may be, to all the men on the conversation, definitely get involved and do your part.
Thank you, Landon, for adding that perspective. Antonia, have you fixed your audio, or do we go to Jenny?
I believe it should work
Yes,
now, if that's okay.
perfect. Yes.
So I would just briefly follow up on London's comments. And I think for us as an organization, gender lens investments have been an important part of what we do. I think we've pointed out the commercial reasons why an investor might be doing that, right? Because it does lead to interesting economic opportunities and an interesting way of looking at investees and potentially look for innovation and so on and so forth. But also because with scale, with being a global player, with being a platform, obviously comes a lot of opportunity to get in touch with exciting projects and with exciting investors that want to be matched to those projects. So I think overall it's been also a good business for the financial services sector, and probably we shouldn't deny that. We should, if anything, encourage more of the financial sector to be a part of this because it is a good opportunity. So I just wanted to maybe mention that as a final comment. And of course, for me personally, it's very important, but I also think for other investors, it's becoming a material financial issue for them to work on.
Thank you so much. Jenny, final words?
Thank you very much. Yeah, just to say on the kind of motivation, I think it's having worked on and been kind of attached to the issue of women's rights and gender equality for many years. I just keep seeing this sort of idea that, oh, it will kind of happen, we can mainstream it and it's just going to happen by itself, and it's not. We need the money to make it happen, and that's just something that really has been quite important to me. And obviously I'm quite privileged to work at the OECD and work with all of these data that we have and be able to actually use them and make the case for financing for gender equality. And linked to that, maybe as my final word, just to say that I think this has come up throughout this discussion, this point about how important it is to work together as different types of actors working with different types of financing, and how different types of financing can support different areas, different aspects of gender equality and women's rights. And not any specific little point of financing can't do everything, but they need to come together. So I think it's really about collaborating everyone and kind of pushing the field ahead together, especially today when we see kind of the global context change and shift. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And indeed, on that point, we invited you because you come with so different perspectives. We have the larger trends in the ODA. We have the role of the stock exchanges and role of a bank like yours in wealth management and the work you do to drive financing to gender equality. So I would like to thank you so much to everyone and hand it back to Miwa to close us off. Thank you so much for all the participants and our brilliant speakers today.
No, thank you so much. I'll be very brief since we are already over time. I'd like to just remind you that there will be an evaluation survey when you're exiting the room, so please fill it out. So we are actually currently in the process of preparing for our next webinar series that will kick off later this year, and we are looking for topics that we want to hear about. Lastly, we are coming back with another session, deep dive session in July to discuss about the private sector's role in creating employment opportunities to support women in poverty. And we'll send you an invitation, but also registration will be available on our website as well. And I'm sharing the screen so that you can follow us on LinkedIn. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us and have a great one. Thank you.